Hello. Today we will look at Fred Botting's analysis of Gothic in his book Gothic and how that relates to Bram Stoker's Dracula and Anna Lilia Amarpour's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Okay, first of all, what is Botting's synopsis? The protagonist, while in the dreary setting in Gothic literature, has evolved from the pre-feminist period to the post-feminist, where the heroine has evolved, often fighting evil capitalistic forces that possess supernatural powers. But how does this apply to Dracula and A Girl Walks Home Alone? Well, first of all, let's look at assess Botting's analysis. The setting. Okay, it's often dark and dreary, isolation in the wilderness, intimidating environment with decaying property, difficult to access. Okay, apart from ghost magic, etc., the major premise for Botting's analysis is that the vampire is a metaphor for the capitalist system, as Marx described. Okay, you've got all sorts of metaphors like sucking the blood out of the labor. So that's a big premise for that Botting refers to. So the protagonist and antagonist, pre-feminist versus post-feminist, Botting describes the evolution of the female protagonist, battles the oppression of the patriarchy and a male antagonist. Okay, now first of all, we'll look at Dracula. First of all, the setting in Dracula, Dracula's castle. It's very, again, you have, as Botting described, difficult to access, masses of greyness, howling wolves, and an intimidating environment. So it's and once you get there, there's moth-eaten furniture and there are no exits. And his castle in England, Carfax, was very similar. Had lots of rats and dogs when they were trying to enter. We'll talk a bit more about shortly. You have the supernatural versus the science. The Botting describes, and we see this battle in Dracula. Dr. Van Helsing tries to convince Stewart of the supernatural, where Lucy is part of the undead. She's gone from the living that hasn't crossed over into the dead yet, and that's because Dracula has infected her. So Dracula, the antagonist, is everything like as Botting describes. He looks more dead than alive, according to Harker. Bad breath, and he is the capitalistic vampire to which Marx refers. Extreme wealth and exploits his victims. So who is the protagonist? There are a few protagonists in Dracula. You could mount the case for Van Helsing or Stewart, but Mina Harker is the heroine. Okay? She is referred to with some patriarchal views. Stewart describes her as having a man's brain, which is meant to be a compliment, but to take down Dracula is no part for a woman. And Van Helsing concludes that she's not to be worried about that, very akin to the patronizing, don't worry your pretty little head. But her husband concedes that she is the energy and brains behind the operation. She assesses the pros and cons of accessing by road, rail, or water, and tries to work out in chess moves what Dracula is doing. Okay, so that's Dracula. Now let's look at A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Now the setting there is again very dark and dreary, a desolate town, decaying factories, smoke blowing out of them, very drab and dreary atmosphere, and what Marx would describe as late-stage capitalism, and it's filmed in black and white to highlight the dreariness. Okay, but in this movie, as opposed to Dracula, the vampire is the heroine. Okay, she's the one to take down the evils of capitalism. So you're fighting a vampire with a vampire, as per Marx's analogy. And the evil capitalist is Saeed, the antagonist, who represents greed, exploitation, and the evils of capitalism. He is a truly vile character. He's a drug dealing pimp exploits the weakness of Arish's old man, or father, who's a drug addict, and takes possession of Arish's car in payment of those debts. The vampire witnesses the heroine, the girl, witnesses his mistreatment of Atty, one of his employees, when he's demanding sexual favors and refuses to pay her. And thus, in her natural form, she goes back to Saeed's place on the premise of spending the night with him and takes him out and kills him. And then a new villain emerges, who happens to be Hussein, the drug addict, Arish's father. Once Arish takes the suitcase full of money and drugs after the death of Saeed, Hussein uses those ill-gotten gains of Saeed and tries to harass Atty for sex, who is again the victim. And once again, the vampire, the heroine, takes out the villain. So different ends of capitalism are taken out by our heroine. Again, we have the battle between the supernatural world and the natural world. A romance develops between Arish and the girl, but she remains in human form while with Arish, because Arish is not evil. He's flawed, he's got his faults, but he's not evil, and a romance develops. But Arish thinks to himself, there's something doesn't add up here, and he can't work out if the supernatural world, or she's part of that, has dispensed with his father and Saeed. So in conclusion, both Dracula and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night have very bleak settings as per Botting's analysis. Dracula, the vampire, is the antagonist and represents capitalism. In A Girl Walks Home at Night, the vampire is the heroine and is fighting capitalism. Another vampire versus vampire. Dracula has a female protagonist working with other male protagonists. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night has a definitive heroine. And thus concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.